PowerPoints for the presentations today. So the first of these is the research events calendar that provides information about all of our upcoming events this spring. So you'll note that there will be another another distinguished lecture series presentation on March 31st with all of our new faculty members. So that's Drs. Harp, Hunter, Dr. Bolitskaya, and Dr. Wen are going to be presenting on their research. So it's a great way to get to know what our new faculty members are doing. Dr. Hunter is here today. And then the other item I wanted to draw your attention to, you can find more information on this colorful flyer here about the CCTS annual conference. Our new dean, Dr. Donna Arnett, is going to be providing the keynote presentation for the CCTS conference. And we're also holding our CPH Student Research Day in conjunction with the CCTS conference. So abstracts for that are due March 25th. They can be abstracts on your capstone projects or on work you're doing with faculty members. So I encourage everyone to submit to that. Cash prizes are available. You'll get great feedback from interdisciplinary faculty members. And the conference is well worth attending, even if you don't have research to present. You get to attend all the panels during the day, free food, really great opportunity. Then the final event to which to draw your attention is a research piece competition on Thursday, April 7th. Details about that will be forthcoming. So again, look at this colorful flyer for information about the CCTS Research Day and attendance. And final administrative note here, if you did not sign in when you came in with the pizza, there's a sign-in sheet out there, so please sign in on your way out so we can have accurate accounting of who's attended. And you can also, after you sign in, pick up your attendance sheet after the presentation if you need documentation of your attendance through these attendance certificates. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our two presenters for the day. First, Dr. Lorie Chesnut is going to be talking with us about effective ways to present information in graphic form as an oral presenter. And this is highly relevant, of course, for anyone who's going to be presenting capstone research. There are a lot of ineffective ways and very effective ways to use this technology. And Lorie, as an epidemiologist, has a lot of expertise. And also, she's regularly consults with the state, right? So the state and different kinds of practice-based partners who need to receive this information in the easiest form to be digested. So we're very lucky to benefit from her experience. Then Dr. Sabrina Brown in the back here will be presenting after Dr. Chesnut and discussing effective oral presentation strategies. And Dr. Brown's background is actually in broadcast journalism before coming to epidemiology. So she's able to leverage a lot of those oral communication strategies in research context that'll be really helpful for you all. So this combination of graphic presentation and oral presentation, again, should be helpful for considering how best to present your research projects going forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Chesnut.
First of all, I will admit that I get a little too caught up in the details of doing these sometimes. I think this is my expressive outlet. I'm not an artist, so I like to do this. And when Margaret asked me to prepare something, this is primarily for students. But hopefully there's some tips in here that all of you can use. There's another presentation that is going to be emailed by Margaret after this, and is how to create these graphs in Excel using Excel 2013. I give you a breakdown of exactly how to do all these types of graphs, including the high-low graphs, which I have to credit Dr. David Menino for introducing to me too. So that will be coming forth, and if you use Excel 2007, I have that version as well, so please just let me know. So I'm going to start off with some general rules for presenting data. One of the things I love, and I'll just tell you, is this little clicker thing that takes me from being away from the desk. They're not very expensive, and I love the flexibility, so I tend to stand over here. I don't like to be caught behind there. We're also going to talk about some various types of graphs, what is best for the data that you're trying to, and the ideas that you're trying to represent. Then I'm going to give you some student examples. We have some excellent student work that we've had over the years. I've just pulled a few of those. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea about some tables. So to start off with, even the most experienced presenters have a hard time presenting data. It can be very complicated. Getting your ideas across simply and concisely to an audience is really important, and it's not an easy thing. I've been to conferences where I've seen really celebrated researchers lose an audience because the data that they've presented is too complex. You really have to know your audience, and you have to know who you're presenting to and what you want to get across. What you're going to do to a lay audience or community audience is going to be different than for your dissertation or your capstone. Completely different types of levels of precision. So know your audience. This document I'm going to send around. This is one of the nicest books. It's called Making Data Talk. It's from the National Cancer Institute. It's been around a few years, but the students that I have in my classes, I always talk about it because it's such a nice, easy. Now this is typically for community types of presentations, but a lot of the material that I got is in this document. So if you don't mind, I'll just start that around so that you guys can see it, and I've given you a link here at the bottom of the presentation. So the first thing I want to say is don't overwhelm your audience. You notice I'm using a very plain PowerPoint template. It's nothing fancy, there's no beautiful scenes in the back. It's okay if your very opening slide might have a gorgeous scene of some kind, but generally, especially if you're doing a capstone or a dissertation or a professional presentation, simple is best. You're the focus, your data is the focus, not the template. Items that you have close together tend to be perceived in a visual presentation like this as being related. So you really have to think through that, and I'll be showing you some examples of that. When you have a title on a graph, make sure that it's very distinctive and it tells what is in the graph, and I'll show you a little bit about that. Also make sure to include your measurement, which often students forget, and also make sure to identify your source. It gives you credibility. If there's data up there, but I don't know where it's from, I don't know where you got it from the CDC, at the National Center for Health Statistics, from your own, or if you just got it off Wikipedia. So always present a source on there, and that is often left off student presentations. Round your numbers. Now this is if you are presenting to a lay audience. If you're doing a capstone, talk to your chairperson, because the level of precision that they may want you to have might be different. Some people want to have 2 extra digits, but to a lay audience, generally simpler is better. So that really depends on the situation. And remember that the audience member should look at your slide and have enough information to understand the context, the source of the data, so that they, in a very short amount of time, can understand what you're trying to present to them. That's one of the reasons to keep it simple, because we can't overwhelm. They have to be able to really read this. Also consider what you're trying to communicate. When you do a visual, you can't do visuals for everything. You have to really understand what makes the best presentation, what information is key for you to get across. When you're doing this type of a presentation, you only have a few minutes with an audience, and each slide you might only have up there for a few seconds. So you've got to be able to click through them quickly. Make sure you've got the correct graph, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that, and think about your colors that you're using. You always have to test a presentation out, particularly if you're going to be doing a dissertation or capstone in the room that you're actually going to be using. Because the colors that I see on that screen may be very different than what you're seeing. So always, if you're doing something really important, test it out in that room before you actually present. And never, never, never use red letters on a blue background. That's what it looks like. Would that be torture to have to read something like that? So be very cognizant about the colors that you're putting together when you're doing a presentation. My husband has an art background, and he always just he sees things online and he comes and tells me, oh, that looks so horrible, can you imagine that? It's a lot of fun to be kind of creative, but this is painful. Here we have many different colors. Sometimes people use a bunch of different colors to try to illustrate different things. The word's really difficult, you can't see it all, they're in very pale yellow, so be careful. And again, think through the colors you're using when you're doing a presentation online. And now this is for fun. Don't do this, okay? When I do this for my students, I say this is an illustration of what not to do. You don't need clip art, especially if you're doing a formal presentation. Now pictures are different. If there's a picture that is relevant to the work you're doing, for instance, if you're doing a community intervention and you have a great picture, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but be thoughtful about it. Don't overwhelm too many, and don't use goofy clip arts. PowerPoint gives us a lot of opportunities to do bouncy animations, do whiz whirls, and you'll see a few more just for fun in my presentation. But for formal presentation, they have no place. Again, your focus is on you, your data, your presentation. You want it clean and simple. There's my other whiz whirl that I put in there. So I'm going to talk about 4 different types of charts. These are covered in this book that I'm passing around too. But these are the primary ones that I wanted to present today because for a capstone presentation, these are the So first we have a pie chart. One of the things that you've got to remember is your data has to add up to 100% to use a pie chart. Now one thing I would like you to notice about this, is that the 12 o'clock, the biggest piece here is at 12 o'clock. And it falls around in each of these subsequently smaller sections. This is the appropriate way to do a pie chart. And Excel actually defaults to this now, Excel 13. You will see online where cells where that is not necessarily at 12 o'clock. Most people, though, that really do this professionally always have them laid out this way. This is a little detail that epidemiologists love. But that is, again, I think Excel is now defaulting to it in that way. This is really good to highlight how different things relate to one another when you've got a population that adds up to, or numbers that add up to 100%. You always display these slices clockwise from the largest to the smallest. You never really want to do more than, say, 6 different slices, because then it becomes overwhelming and you kind of lose the detail. And look at where I've got my labels. I put them outside the pie. Excel will give you a lot of options on this. Some people put them inside. I don't think that works as well because it's harder to see. But sometimes that might be the appropriate one. But be thoughtful again about where you put your little numbers. You can move each one of these around. In the Excel presentation that we'll send out to you, it will show you how you can change all these. So if you've got this number is kind of interfering with this title, you can eke those out and move them so that they fit better together, so that they relate, the people relate the percent to the color, etc. You also have to be thoughtful in your colors that you use. If you're doing this and it could be printed out on a black and white printer, then you may have to think, can these actually show? Because believe it or not, in local health departments and at the state oftentimes, we don't use color printers, we use black and white. So you do have to think about those colors if you're going to be doing it in black and white. Bar charts illustrate a group of data using percents, dollars, and rates. I would typically use rates. The axes allow us to give some information about 2 different types of numbers. And here I've got my illustration. I've got a rate per 1,000 live births. You can choose either horizontal or vertical. I'm showing you horizontal here. I used, for this particular one, my racial designations are one color, total is another, just so that the reader can very quickly see the difference between the two. That's just a personal option. But that's what I like to do with these. Line charts look for trends over time. And they're really good for illustrating movement of numbers. And you can also add a trend line. And again, on my Excel presentation, Excel 13 will show you how to add a trend line if you want to. You have to be a little judicious in when to add a trend line, but they can be very helpful as well. One thing about doing line charts is consider the scale. Excel decides the scale for you. You don't have to keep it that way, because often it can be actually misleading. It can make us think that something is much worse than it really is, and I'll show you an illustration of that in a moment. Don't use fancy markers, keep it simple. That's another option you'll have, is to use little X's and little circles to mark each year. Keep it simple, and don't use more than 4 lines of data, generally. I mean, I have seen people that have used 20 lines, and you have so many things going so many places, you may want to consider breaking that into 2 different ones, or you have to reconsider whether that's appropriate information to share. This is an example of one that is not done yet. This was default. This was my data I put into Excel. This was what it gave me back. I have no axes title, so I really don't know. The reader would not know what that is. Look at how it defaulted the axes here. It gave me the scale that I didn't really like, because it made, to me, the differences look much larger than they really are. I didn't like the colors they gave me, and look at all these lines. It's distracting. The title isn't very good. It doesn't have any of the information that I want. So this isn't really what I want. I want something a lot more refined than that. What I did is I took this. So first I put a title in the axes. I gave my per 1,000 live births. I have simplified the numbers. I've taken out a couple lines here. You'll see another illustration, and I've made a better title and put a source information. But this, I'm sorry. I will give you another example, because I did this another way in just a moment. This is called a double break. Apparently, Excel can do this. I've never tried it, but I've given you some information there of how you can get to that information by doing this in Excel. So if your numbers are vastly different, for instance, these couple cities have very high numbers compared to the rest, it didn't make sense to be on a graph. It just didn't work. So they did this, what they call double break. So that link will take you on how to do that in Excel. I've never used this because most of what I work with are rates, and I just don't necessarily need this. I don't use pure numbers. This is an example of what not to do when you may want to look at a trend line. And I have seen presenters use many things like this. It's just too much information. You can't really look at it. I might be able to see that Mississippi is the highest and USA is the lowest, but beyond that, there's just too many numbers. It's too much information. This is where a line chart might be a lot better. But I don't like those little markers, so I'm going to take them out, and I'm going to make them a lot simpler so that you can see it much easier. You don't have all the busyness. And then what I decided to do too, since everybody is up above 10%, I changed my scale on the side, and I put a trend line in. So this is just an option. This is a personal preference. This might be a nice way to look at it. You can manipulate all of these aspects of the Excel. You can take lines out, you can make them a pale gray so that they're not quite as observant, so that you don't, does not distract from the lines. There's many options. Making your own graphs is a lot of fun. As I mentioned, I get a little bit in the weeds sometimes because I have too much fun. But I think it's really nice, and when I need a break from writing, I often will try a graph because that makes me happy, and then I can go back to writing again. And I get kind of a little bit of satisfaction. So let me show you some student examples here. First of all, this is Hung Lu, who graduated, I think, 2 years ago. She is now in our doctoral program. What I really liked here is she gave you on the side some content information. And she did this herself in a graph, and as she worked through her presentation, she highlighted the particular area that she was in. I just thought this is a nice way to progress, particularly for a capstone, to help the viewer kind of get into an idea of where they are. This is called a DAG, and for those of you that are in EPI, this should look familiar. Hung Lu did this DAG to help her understand kind of what she was looking at with her study. She was comparing Appalachian women and non-Appalachian women access to care for cancer treatments. And so this DAG kind of helped her think through her variables, what variables she wanted to use, and she then showed this to her committee, which gave us a very nice visual. And this is a free program that is online. It's a lot of fun to use, and it really helps us think through our confounding variables and intervening variables, etc. Hung Lu also presented this nice flow chart, which gave us very quickly an idea about our sample size, how it was determined. I will suggest to you that you need to make sure you add your numbers up and make sure that there's no problems. I've even seen in publications where the numbers have not quite added up correctly, but this is a great way to help somebody that's observing what you're doing kind of see quickly how your sample size was determined. This is by Seth Saime, who defended last week. These are two bar graphs, two separate bar graphs, showing comparing education and annual household income. As you can see, they move together, and that was his point that he was showing us. I really like the fact that he's color coordinated so beautifully. Look where he put his information. It's just very easy to read. He's given us confidence intervals, and he's made these bars behind a little grayish so that it doesn't quite stand out quite as much, and you can really look at the information. Seth put a lot of time into his work, and I thought he did a very nice job in this color coordination. It has all the pieces and parts that we need. And this is one of Seth's maps. When you are doing maps, make sure that you think through your color scheme. Don't do wildly different colors. The tradition is that as you get higher rate, you have a deeper color, and lower is a lighter color, which you can see he did here. He's also given us prevalence rates, and he's told us statewide, as well as given us comparison to the U.S. This is such a wonderful slide. It's got everything we need on it. It's easy to look at and quick to understand what we're looking at. And this is Seth's table. Sometimes your tables are going to be too big to put up as just a document, clipping it into a PowerPoint. Seth recreated his tables. He actually had a table in two parts. Slide one was the first part, and this was the second part. Whenever he had a significant result, he put it in red. It's a great way to do it. When you've got too much data up there, again, as a viewer, you guys cannot go through all that information. What we really are looking at is looking at these significant numbers and trying to understand that. You can see how nicely he structured this table. Everything is very uniform. And another way you can do this is to put a box. If you want to draw your attention over there, you can just put a box, take out the fill, and just have the outline. So these are just some tricks to doing data quickly so that the viewer can understand quickly. This is an example from Megan Toll, who graduated about 3 years ago. I just thought it was a very nice little visual. She was looking at the pain and compromised movement in the jaw. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. But I like how she did that. She said the patients that had it, those that didn't, and then she broke that out into this visual. And then this is called a high-low graph. And again, Dr. David Menino is the one I have to credit with this. He was the one that had his students use this. And I think it's a great way to show logistic regression results, adjusted odds ratios. I've given you instructions in my PowerPoint how to do these. Here we have the reference. The little triangles here are on the line on 1. This is a logarithmic scale, and you can very easily see the odds ratios and the confidence intervals and see what crosses a line, what is significant and what is not significant. I love this kind of format. This is what I did for my capstone after having seen what Megan did. So it's just a very useful visual. You can change these little triangles into diamonds. You can do a lot with them. You can change the colors. There's a lot of flexibility with this. I love looking at this. Of course, an audience member that was your dissertation committee would want your full table. But if you want to present it to a group of people, it's a great way to show it very quickly. So just to close, I want to do a little bit of the tables, and I'm not going to talk about the content of these. I've given you references for all of these so you can take a look. I just picked out some that I thought were particularly nice and particularly clean looking. And this one is very clean and uncluttered. It's got nice white space. White space is a good thing. We want to have people be able to see very clearly. Notice just a few horizontal lines. There's no boxes. They've taken that all out and they've put it in Excel so that you don't have that clutter. This is a style for a particular journal. They vary, and I'll show you some different examples. Note for students that percent is noted up here. You don't have to keep repeating that down here. If it's presented up at the top, in this particular table, you don't have to repeat it. I've seen people that put percent and then put percent all the way down. Again, simple and clear is the primary thing. The numbers are provided and percents all the way here. Here we've got percents with confidence intervals, and here we have adjusted odds ratios and confidence intervals. Reference category is simply denoted as REF period. You will see that done differently. Again, that's a journal-specific requirement, but I really like how this one looks. This is similar to what you saw from Hung Lu. It's kind of a flow chart showing how you got the sample size. I just thought this was very nicely done, so I wanted to include it too. There's another table, a different style. This journal allowed color. You can see some color up here. You can see a lot more horizontal lines. Here we have just a p-value. In this particular illustration, you've got the percent, the categories over on the side. So if you're mixing, if you've got, for instance, a mean and a percent, or different types of tests, you may want to have that denoted here because it can't be denoted up here as easily. So this is just a different style that was the journal's choice. Now, I just want to close today by bringing forth one paper that I won't go through, and this was done kind of tongue-in-cheek too with the cow. This is it's called Cattle-Related Injuries and Farm Management Practices on Kentucky Beef Cattle by Drs. Browning, Dr. Westmeats, Dr. Sanderson, and Dr. Debbie Reed in 2012. And Susan is here, and she is raising her hand back here. She has volunteered to help students set up tables. So don't everybody swamp her when we leave. She is just amazing at doing this and at managing the information. And I picked this paper because I thought, don't do that, okay? That was just for fun. That was just for fun, just to show you what not to do. Here are their two opening tables. They're first and second. These are the descriptive epi tables. Look how clean they are, how easy to read they are. Look at, for this particular one, they used one digit, and she kept it consistent. You don't round up. If you choose one digit, use one digit all the way down. If it goes to 4.0, you make sure that 0.0 is on there. So it's not just 4. If you use two digits, it's 4.00. So just be consistent whatever you choose. And again, that's something to talk to your chair about. For this table, I think this is an amazing table. The amount of information on here is huge, and I can't even think about how much time it must have taken to figure out how to organize this. Notice that univariate is in the title. We don't have to guess about what we're looking at here. We know this is a univariate table. It gives us immediate ideas about what we're looking at. It's a slightly different journal or style based on the journal. Notice they've got confidence intervals here instead of p-values. There are, the reference category is noted as a dash rather than REF. And I just think this is a beautiful, and I want to credit Susan for having probably laid this table out. I think she said that she remembers doing it. This is an awesome feat to be able to put that much information in a single table and make it look that good. And this is their third table, or their fourth table, which also has some nice notes at the bottom. Again, tells us something a little bit different, but it's a super table. And we've got the locale going. So to close, read the literature and find a style that matches your work. If you're a student and if you're not sure how to do this, go to papers that you like, papers that speak to you, and look and see how they do it. We have many, many examples there that we can get to emulate. Look at the bound capstones in the admissions office. They're down by Laverne. There's a whole wall of bound capstones. Be sure to look at your concentration, because different concentrations will organize things differently. She can help you with that, or the people in admissions can help you. Think clean and simple lines, don't clutter, whether you're doing a PowerPoint presentation or a table. And make sure if you're a student and you've got a draft PowerPoint presentation, show it to your chair at least a week before you're actually going to do the defense, because they may need to tweak it for you a little bit. And let your chair kind of guide you as to some of the particulars, like what level of precision to use and how they might like to see your tables. And let's see, this will be sent to everybody. If you have any questions about it, let me know. It's relatively, I just did it, and it should illustrate all those graphs for you. Thank you.
I think we're going to have questions at the end, so let's move right along. Just a little background, because I don't know a lot of you, a few people I do know, and I've worked with some students in the room today. I am Sabrina Brown, and I also am an assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology. I'm also the director of the Kentucky Violent Death Reporting System. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay. The Kentucky Violent Death Reporting System is part of a national program, which now 32 states are funded and participate in. Some students I've worked with have worked primarily with Kentucky data. Some have used the whole national data. And I just to let you know, because I know this group's mostly students, I do take about 3 doctoral students a year and about 3 master's students a year, if you're interested, as I talk about what this research activity is today. So why I'm here, I guess, is because of my previous experience primarily. I had a 10-year career in the media. I started pretty young with my own radio show. I've done everything from an associate producer of a documentary to public radio anchor, reporter, to the flagship of the East Coast, news reporter, covered the court beat. I've covered current events. I've covered breaking news. That was my last reporter gig. That's what they call them. So the WAM, that's the flagship of the East Coast, and that's what catapulted me into television. It was a large enough radio station that they trusted I could handle the television audience. But I will tell you, just a little FYI, radio personalities are introverts. So television, we're more extroverts, so I fit more into the television realm than the radio, because you're just sitting in a little booth by yourself, just you, yourself, and I, and you're talking to a lot of people, but you don't see them. But I learned a lot of skills in my journalism career, which I'm going to talk about. Then I was a producer, so I learned to write quickly, get to the point, stack news stories, and then lastly, I was a breaking news reporter, and I did a lot of live shots. So I came on at 2:30 in the afternoon, and so I did the live shots right at the 6 o'clock, and then usually 11 o'clock somewhere in the state. I was rolling up, you know, because you got to get hands-on. It's not always glamorous. And the reason why I transitioned was my last story. It was a field trip, because I was breaking news, so I had a lot of the gore and the death and mayhem. there was a field trip to the gorge, New River Gorge. No, is that the New River Gorge? Is that Red River Gorge? And a student had fallen in and died. And so I was supposed to have the live shot at the location of the school where the buses were coming in. So we started to reel up our live shot antenna, and they started to throw rocks at me, the parents that were there. And I just didn't have a good feeling about that. I started to have some ethical dilemmas. Why am I shoving a microphone in people's faces at the worst times in their life? Fires, death, abuse, violence. I couldn't come to grips with it. So I transitioned into the academic world, which is still investigative. The reporters are investigative, detectives are investigative. So I've kind of put it all together into one package. So I'm working on the violent death reporting system. I used to be a reporter that covered that, and now I'm working with cops, coroners, medical examiners that I used to work with in my journalism career. Now I'm working with them in a more helpful way to prevent these deaths that I once covered. So it's not less it is less glamorous, but it's much more meaningful. And I'm glad I made the transition, even though it hurts sometimes to be in research. It really does. It doesn't feel good to sit and do table after table and make it look good and then try to present it in an articulate manner. It takes a lot of time and a lot of work. And by the way, I didn't mention this, I'm research faculty, which is why I only teach one class. I teach public health response to terrorism and disasters, which is in the fall. But I do work with students, but I'm limited because I am on 95% federal dollars. I'm funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And my work sometimes in academia is not orthodox. I go outside the box a little bit, and sometimes I get my hand slapped. But sometimes the work is more compelling this way. So I don't mind being outside the box. It's okay. It's a little uncomfortable probably for other people more than myself. So my presentation is kind of opposite of Dr. Chesnut's, but you know what, I'm going to hold on to your presentation for other PowerPoints because we do have to present a lot of graphs and tables and maps. But I want to go back to where it all begins. Where does research begin? I went to my son's 6th grade science fair. He made it to the regionals. This was the first time he had a big project to do, and he goes to Good Shepherd Catholic School in Frankfurt, so this was the whole diocese, and it was a really big deal. And I learned a lot that day, actually, as I walked around and I listened to these 10-year-olds to 14-year-olds, it was middle school. I learned that what was behind them was important, what they had prepared and their papers and their materials, that was all behind them, but what was more important was how they communicated with the judges. How do you become engaging with your audience? Whoever you're talking to, whether it's one person, a group, a room like this, a larger audience, or even on Fox News or CNN, whichever side you fall on, it's all the same sort of communication. Marketing, journalism, we're all trying to sell our ideas. We might have different perspectives that we're coming from, the media versus research, like my transition. I'm coming from different perspectives. However, I'm coming at it the same way I did previously to now. I'm incorporating my journalism career to get funding, to keep funding, and then to make policy and practice change. Because you don't want to stop at your papers and your grant writing. You want to actually make a change. That's what we're here to do as public health professionals. So always keep that in the back of your mind. How am I going to keep this out of the drawers? How am I going to get this paper that no one would never read? How am I going to market it to the general population? You have to be passionate. I'm very passionate about my work. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work. You have to have that passion, even as a 6th grader. The projects that won, you could tell the students had thought of it themselves, they thought about it a lot, and they were passionate about it. When you pick your capstone, pick something you love, that you want to learn more about, and then find the person that has that data or that information that you want. But start with what you're interested in. When you're watching the news, what compels you to want to read more? Okay, I'm gonna go on the internet and look into that a little bit more. Think about the ideas that you have, and a class, a professor, and go with what you love. You have to be passionate. And I've learned that with everything in research. If I'm not passionate, it's not going to get funded. Right, Dr. Young? That's another thing, engage your audience. you know, this is just communication 101. If you're looking here, if you're standing here, you're not going to be very persuasive. I went to a conference for the last 2 days, and the people were reading their notes off of the screen here. First of all, you can't hear me very well, right? Where am I looking? I wanted to take a nap. You've got to look your audience in the eye. And like I said, one person to television media. You are looking camera in the eye, you're looking people in the eye, you're engaging them, bringing them into conversation. Your writing needs to be engaging. You want to take those reviewers and say, you want to fund me. You do. I will compel you to fund me. That's how you're writing. And the CDC, just a little side note, I'm going to go into a project that I'm working on with the CDC. So there's 32 states funded, and they select me to write discussion sections for them, be the content expert, because they say, well, first of all, you don't have to go through clearance. Second of all, you are compelling. That journalism comes out in the discussion section. So I get to be on these really cool projects because of that. But anyone can do it, because you have to be passionate. You can write a really good discussion section if you're passionate about it, because you think about it more. You think about it from the individual perspective instead of being caught up at the population level, where all of us can get stuck in the ends and the sample sizes and lose perspective of that individual person. I was at a meeting for suicide prevention task force. Well, this was early on in my career. Little did I know that there are advocates and there are survivors that go to those meetings. I was used to the academic world. I was presenting my data. Gentleman stood up in the back of the room and said, one of those 5, that was my daughter. Well, you know what? I changed the way I gave presentations from then on. And I always try to remember that individual. In every presentation I give, I always tell a story, and I get away from the tables. Also, I mentioned cops, coroners, medical examiners. They don't know how to understand PowerPoint. They haven't learned how to, you take a lot of classes and you learn how to read your syllabus, you know what the teacher expects, you learn how to read PowerPoints, you learn how to take what is important from the slides. They don't know. I don't use PowerPoint ever. When I go to speak to the coroners, to cops, I'll use handouts if I have maps or tables to talk about. I walk the room. They're ready to go to sleep if they're not hungover. You know, I talk to them. I walk in the room. You can smell it sometimes. Look at what they have to do with coroners. Passion, persuasive. You're a business marketer. You want to sell your research idea, no matter what it is. If you're excited about it, someone else could get excited about it. And then you have to be persistent. And let's get back to how it hurts to write a grant. The Kentucky Violent Death Reporting System, it took me 3 years, 3 times. The 3rd time was the charm. Do you know how hard it is when you fail? I don't know if any of you have submitted something for publication. Have any of you submitted yet? I don't know anyone that hasn't gotten it back with very harsh critiques and reviews. You know, you're going to get that feedback. And it's that persistent gene. You just get back on the horse. You get angry, you get back on the horse, and you do it even better the next time and learn from those comments and those scores. And you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again until it gets published. You have to be prepared. The students that won the science fair, they, at 12 years old, 10 years old, they had their cards, and they were talking to the judges. They were making eye contact with the judges. They weren't even looking at their boards. They were using their cards, maybe look down a little bit, but it made them look even more professional with their little note cards. And the purpose of this study, my hypothesis, they started in 6th grade, the scientific method. When people ask me what I do for a living, I say, remember that class you hated in college or high school and you had to write a paper at the end? That's what I do for a living. So now we'll jump forward to now and talk about grants, manuscripts, and of course capstones, where it all begins. Capstone is very important. And I should have probably put it in the reverse order. You start with a capstone, goes to a manuscript, goes to a grant, or a grant and manuscript. But you do want your capstone to be published. Go ahead, make it hurt, keep going and going, and faculty can start to ignore you once you leave their vision, you know, and you're off campus, but you've got to pursue, that's that persistence. You've got to pursue that until it's published. You really, really want your capstone published. So let's incorporate the 6th grade science fair into grant writing, because that's a really boring lecture. How do you write a grant? Oh, I would lose an audience. If it weren't for you guys, I'd probably lose an audience in the general population. To just put a team together, to convince another colleague that they want to work with you, takes some passion, takes some persuasion. Especially quality, seasoned faculty or colleagues, you have to have something to offer. You have to have your idea fairly developed in order to put your team together. To convince leaders to give you support. So my 3rd application to the CDC, I had a letter of support from Governor Ernie Fletcher. And I realized from my comments from the 1st application to the 2nd, that was what was going to propel me into funding, to show that I had support from the highest levels of government. Because the problem is, with grant funding, you want to get the funding, but then you want to do what you say you're going to do. And that can be worse than not getting the funding at all, because then that funding agency doesn't trust you anymore. Believe me, they remember. So there was problems in Kentucky with other grants that had been funded and making promises for police data in particular, and then not being able to follow through. So we had to show that we had the top leaders in the state, because if it's coming down, if the governor's supporting you, and then the chiefs of police, the Kentucky State Police, then it's going to trickle down to the local law enforcement. To have access to the data. It's also a time commitment, and it's also risky. Why would we let you in our filing cabinets? What are you going to say about us? What if our record keeping isn't where it needs to be? What if we rank lowest of all the NVDRS states? You know, there's a lot of risk involved. So you have to be passionate and you have to be persuasive to get prepared to write a grant. It hurts. And by the end, when you're down to the forms and dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, you're begging Margaret to do it for you. Please do my job for me. I can't do this one more minute. But you can't. You've gotta finish it out. Just get it over the finish line. And that takes persistence. And then you want to maintain your funding. How do you maintain your funding? The same way. You can't lose your passion after it's funded. That's where you have to maintain what you've already done. And my tables are terrible. I threw those in today, and I have to give credit. My research assistant's wonderful SAS analyst, Jacqueline Seals, is in the back, and she helps me. And I put her on the spot just to throw something in here to talk about what we're doing in the next few weeks. So this is something I'm passionate about. This is youth suicide, and this is why I'm passionate about it. In 2005, we started with about 800 violent death cases a year. We are well over 1,100 now. So here we are getting more and more funding at the national level, and our numbers are going up, up, up. And what is particularly concerning to me is the females. And this is very preliminary right here, 2014. The females are using, whereas before they used to attempt suicide, poisoning, less lethal means, they are now becoming equal with the boys and using guns more and more. So next week there was a cluster of youth suicides, and so I'm meeting with superintendents, board of directors, teachers, suicide advocacy people. We are going to lay the numbers out and see what we can do, because there's a very simple message that we need to send to caregivers, parents, teachers, youth leaders, and that is youth minds are not as developed as adult minds. So we know over the years, okay, we break up with somebody, we are bullied, we have a problem with a family member, we know eventually it's going to resolve or it's not, but we know that we can move on. With teenagers, they think it's the end of the world, and they don't know, it might be the first time, and they can't process it. So we need to not let them be alone. So that's really the main message that I'm going to bring to the table. You don't leave them alone. If they lock themselves in the room, you take the door off the hinges. You don't leave a teenage girl alone when she's just broken up with her boyfriend. You don't leave a guy alone when he's just broken up with his girlfriend. You monitor computers, pull them out into the living room. You don't let them be alone when they're struggling with crisis. They can't handle that crisis situation. We find that youth suicides happen at a much faster rate. It's more impulsive than adult. These are just some of the things that we're getting passionate about because we're starting to understand and we're starting to see where we can make a difference. So this year after year, collecting this data, doing all this PR work, now we're going to start to make a difference. Now people see us as relevant and see us as important, and now we have the numbers, the empirical evidence to back the anecdotal stories and give the advocates the ammunition they need to stop. No pun intended there at all. Here's a map that Jacqueline put together. These are some clusters of suicide. So the youth suicides are becoming of specific interest right now because we're seeing pockets. And so these are, we just put, Jacqueline puts together maps on request, or if we start to see, we are always looking for trends and patterns. This was a request from Western Kentucky, the television station out there. They wanted to know why our surveillance system is the only system that can explain why. And that's left to the investigators if they collect that information at the scene. So we also have a grant out to collect better information at the death scene or the violent scene. But as you can see, look at these percentages. You wouldn't think intimate partner problems in youth. Another way to maintain your funding, to keep all of your partners engaged, is to give back to them. So Louisville Metro asked us, Louisville Metro Police Department, if we give you all of our data, whatever we have from all of our detectives and investigative information, would you help us understand what's going on in Louisville, because we're having a spike in suicides. So we, Jacqueline again did this by zip code. This is just the zip codes and then what was intimate partner problem related suicides and then the rates. And then we can identify by zip code to allocate resources. So they want this for suicides, they want this for homicides, they want this for overdoses. They want to use our information to allocate troopers on the ground. Also something that we can work together with law enforcement is intimate partner violence, and that is something I'm very passionate about, because when you talk about violent death, you have to talk about chaos in the home. You have to go domestic, behind closed doors. And what we can start to do, since we have years and years of data, is we can say, okay, how many, if we're working with the police, how many times were troopers called to that house before it became a fatality or a homicide-suicide? How many runs? So then we give that information back to the police, tell them where to allocate resources. Well, they are engaged with community leaders that can actually do interventions. But when they are called to a house, they can say, listen, research shows, and we have empirical evidence, on the next run, we're going to find you dead. Hopefully, the same with youth and drugs. Hopefully, we can start to work together more to really make a difference. And that's something to be passionate about. This is a very cluttered slide. This is something that I would not use, but because of the audience that I had, I thought I'd put this in the PowerPoint so you had this for later. And I do need to remove some things because it's unpublished data, but this has been published. And I just want to bring your attention to, okay, so we looked at homicide, suicides involving children. The media lets you believe or leaves out information to make the assumption that it's mostly mothers, right? Would that be your assumption? That it's mostly mothers killing their children than killing themselves? That was the assumption I had going into this. 76 were men and 76 were female victims. Perpetrators, victims. And then the children were equal with sex. And then we found that in 54% of the cases were filicide-suicide, which means the perpetrator killed only the children and not the domestic partner that that person had been abusing. So who's more at risk in these cases? The children are. We want to look at the intersection of domestic violence and homicide-suicide and suicide prevention hotlines, domestic violence interventions. We want to start to see those all combined. So we're looking at several risk factors in one intervention or in one case. And then something of interest that came out of it's a 3-paper series, was that abuse prior to going into divorce court was rarely identified. And if you think about it, if you all are pretty much young, so it's probably not a topic that you're very familiar with, but when you're divorcing and you have children in the mix, if there is domestic violence, what's happening during mediation? What's happening? If there's been domestic violence, if there's been a perpetrator and a victim, and you're supposed to mediate about children, what's going to happen? Who's going to be excited to be in the room? The perpetrator. Who's going to be fearful and be re-victimized in a room that is being mediated? Well, what's going to happen is there's going to be mental health issues when there's domestic violence often, and that person is not going to present very well, the victim. The perpetrator is going to present very well, and in some cases gets full custody of the kids, leaving this cycle to continue. So, this came all out of this investigation that we're doing, or this series of papers. So we have this situation where we found that there were a significant amount of cases of homicide, suicides involving children where there were custody battles, and the perpetrator was killing the children to leave often the mother with boundless loss. The worst form of domestic violence you could even concoct. So we do have an intervention site. We tend to go ER, hospital, those sorts of sites, but we have an intervention site that maybe hasn't been thought about in this arena in violent death, and that is the court systems. So we have court mediators, we have guardian ad litem, those that represent the children, and no training, no standardization, it's all jurisdictional, it's up to the judges. So we have people interviewing children, trying to identify domestic violence because we see how important it is to identify it, and they have no training in order to identify perpetration and where the children should go. So it's a great place for prevention efforts. So we asked the question, is it time to consider federal legislation? So now we want to change policy and practice. And we have, my colleague and I, we have a paper out as a commentary, and now we want to write an op-ed piece also because we want to take that academic research and now get it to the general population. And we also want to write a federal bill to change legislation to help children exposed to these sort of circumstances. So that's kind of the, and these people, you know, in the court systems, they bear great responsibility to identify, and that's the key right here. We've learned with our epidemiological study, what's important is identifying a perpetrator, identifying abuse in a family. And I think we can take questions now, not to leave you on a real high note, but I just want to leave you again with my overall theme. When you're presenting a capstone, be prepared, get your slides ready, have handouts. Don't hand your committee member your whole paper. Give them a handout, like a press release sort of thing, highlighting what you're going to highlight so they can follow along. The easier you make it to follow along, the more organized your presentation is with a capstone, the better. You want to know what's going on behind you, but you don't want to spend a whole lot of time looking behind you. You want to engage, even with your capstone process, and get that buy-in.
Okay, so you do a lot of research, right, in sort of a controversial area that could spill over into things like gun control, right?
Oh, yes, yes.
And so where do you draw the line between being passionate and sounding like an advocate and risking the chance that your audience will see you as not objective anymore? Because, you know, of course, they're trying to see the scientist as an objective scientist just presenting the facts. And then if you let your passion kind of get into that, does it call into question your credibility?
That is a great point. Hang on, that's a great point. Because if you're presenting yourself as a scientist and you're presenting data, you want to make sure that you maintain credibility even in your passion. You have to stick to the data. And there is an institution that they're very much proponents of gun control, And they take their data and the results and they're making too big of leaps. So when there's more stringent gun laws, then gun deaths are reduced. Well, you didn't look at suffocations. You have to look at the whole picture and present. Just don't make as many jumps as your data, like don't make more jumps than your data allows, I guess. So we had ideas going into the homicide-suicide paper, but we didn't, our first paper didn't identify the whole court system and the custody, so we didn't talk about it in the first paper. And then the second paper, we had more data. We went into it with different analysis. We did a very qualitative look at the narrative, really read through it. There were 4 of us that read through because we wanted to find that, but we didn't want to force it. And it did emerge, and then we were able to then talk about it. But you have to be very careful not to make assumptions and jumps. You have to talk about your data and what you found. Let the data talk to you, and then, boy, get on board and talk about it. Now, a lot of the states that are funded are in state governments, and so I have more freedom than the people that work in government about speaking about gun control. But I wouldn't go and talk a lot about my opinion. How I would handle that would say, we need to talk about suicide prevention before we talk about gun control. Let's talk about prevention of all suicide deaths. That's kind of how I would handle that.
So if there are no other questions, we'll be following up with all the materials that our presenters have provided today, as well as the handouts and information about upcoming events. So thank you all so much for being here today, and please thank our presenters one more time.